Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be with you in Korea and to speak to you about the continuing significance of the great American Puritan writer, Jonathan Edwards. And there's a continuing high level of interest in Edwards on the part of scholars and ministers. And these writings have much to offer us as we reflect on the nature and the vitality of the Christian faith and its application to ministry, preaching, spirituality, and apologetics. In this lecture, I hope to explore some themes of interest in those writings and to make some connections with the challenges and opportunities that we face. But first, I need to reflect a little on what it means to speak of Edwards as a Puritan writer. Because as I'm sure you know, the term Puritan is notoriously difficult to define. And this difficulty reflects the fact that it had its origins as a term of stigmatization, used uncritically in a variety of social contexts over a long period of time. Even as early as 1565, Catholic exiles from Elizabethan England were complaining about the hot Puritans of the new clergy. And intensive study of Puritanism in the period preceding the English Civil War have generally concluded that Puritanism was not really a well-defined movement. It rather consisted of a loose association of overlapping groups of people who had various degrees of hostility towards the Church of England and various reasons for feeling alienated from it. And perhaps the most important of these was a sense that their moral and their spiritual concerns were not being adequately fulfilled by the State Church of England. So many scholars now see English Puritanism as a form of Reformed theology which laid particular emphasis upon both the experiential aspects of faith and the divine sovereignty in election. In other words, what some scholars would call an experiential predestinarianism. Now, there are, of course, close connections between English Puritans and continental Reformed theology. That's well known. Nevertheless, the English context does appear to have given rise to a specific form of the Reformed theological vision with an emphasis on pastoral practice and the correlation of theology and human experience. And in fact, this aspect of Puritanism did lead some earlier scholars to treat it as if it was some form of pietism. And it's certainly true that some Puritan writers, like William Perkins, had a concern for the development of an authentic piety through what they called a religion of the heart. But this doesn't mean that there's some kind of theological alignment with those who are formally known as pietists, whose experiential theology and emphasis on a living faith often led them to react against orthodox theological formulations. Now, although English Puritanism never quite recovered from the failure of the Puritan Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell and the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, it nevertheless remained a significant presence in England during the 1660s and 1670s. In fact, Richard Baxter remarked that half of London's population attended nonconformist services on Sundays in the late 1660s. Now, while Puritanism was unquestionably a significant force in England in the late 16th century and throughout the 17th, many would argue it would have its greatest impact in North America. And as I think you know, the tensions between Anglicanism and Puritanism in England led to an exodus of Pilgrim Fathers to the American colonies. And in 1620, the Pilgrim Fathers sailed from Plymouth. And before they left, the great Puritan theologian John Robinson preached a sermon to those about to leave for the New World aboard the Mayflower, depicting the pilgrims as spiritual and theological pioneers who would explore the new world of the Americas on the one hand and the new insights they would find in the Bible as they sought to plant the kingdom of God there. Hear Robinson's words, "I am verily persuaded the Lord hath more truth yet to break out of his holy word. Between 1627 and 1640, some 4,000 people made the hazardous journey across the Atlantic Ocean and settled on the coastline of Massachusetts Bay. And for them, America was the promised land, and they were the chosen people. They saw themselves having been expelled from their Egypt by a cruel Pharaoh and led by God to settle in a new land flowing with milk and honey. And unhindered by any established forms of religion, Puritanism was able to achieve a substantial presence and social influence in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, developing its own distinct ecclesial practices. Whereas the evangelical revival in England largely arose out of the Pietist tradition, Puritan preachers such as Jonathan Edwards, who was the subject of this lecture, would play a significant role in the Great Awakening in North America around the same time. Now, by the end of the first quarter of the 18th century, it seemed to many that New England Puritanism had lost its way. Growing material prosperity in the American colonies was bringing with it an indifference to faith. And one of the most distinctive features of North American Protestant Christianity is this phenomenon of the awakening. And to date, 3 waves of awakening have been documented, although some scholars suggest there may be a 4th, each of which initially leads to religious renewal and then to social change. And in this lecture, I'll be focusing on the first and the most famous of these waves of renewal, which is widely known as the Great Awakening. And this took place in New England in 1734. And sociologists have noted how such religious revivals or times of revitalization often originate in times of cultural stress and uncertainty, and often lead to radical social reform and transformation. So an awakening, although primarily religious in nature, has the capacity to engage with culture as a whole. So let's consider the background against which this Great Awakening took place and the role that Jonathan Edwards played in it. Again, by 1700, American Protestantism seemed to have become stagnant. The first generation of Puritan immigrants from Europe had strong religious motivations, and these were not always shared by their children. Church membership began to decline. Increased immigration from Europe led to the Middle Atlantic states becoming religiously diverse to an extent without parallel elsewhere, raising awkward questions about earlier Puritan visions of what they called a holy commonwealth. And more seriously, a series of scandals rocked the credibility of Puritan institutions. And as many of you will know, the worst of these was the Salem witch trials of 1693, which were instigated by the clergy of that time, leading to the execution of 19 people. And the governor, Sir William Phips, eventually put an end to this hysteria, but this seriously diminished the standing and the reputation of the clergy of the area. So again, to appreciate the significance of the Great Awakening, we need to realize how Protestantism in New England in the early 18th century seemed to be in terminal decline. There were tensions that were beginning to emerge within New England Puritanism over the question of church membership. In the early 17th century, New England congregations generally had a policy of admitting to full membership only those individuals who could tell a narrative of personal conversion. But as the century progressed, fewer and fewer people seemed able to testify to this kind of experience. Yet, most individuals wanted some kind of connection or association with the church, not least on account of the close ties between the church membership and citizenship in many communities. People wanted to have, for example, their children baptized or to have a Christian burial service. So as church attendance began to decline, tensions emerged between those who wanted to maintain religious purity at any cost and those who believed that the churches could only survive by broadening their membership base through adopting less strict criteria of membership. A compromise was reached in what is called the halfway covenant, by which those prepared to formally accept the truth of Christianity and the moral discipline of the church could have their children baptized. And perhaps the result of this idea of a halfway covenant was inevitable. By the beginning of the 18th century, a large proportion of church members were nominal or halfway Protestants. They might attend church, they might have their children baptized, they might recognize Christianity as true and morally helpful, but basically they were unconverted. Identifying as being Christian and attending church were viewed as routine aspects of American society. Being baptized, attending church, was seen as social and cultural duties. Now, the problem here was that pastors of these congregations themselves often seemed to lack any personal faith. Although they were generally well educated, they seemed to lack any sense of the real relevance of the gospel. So increasingly, Christianity came to be viewed in purely moral and social terms. The English preacher George Whitefield, while visiting North America in the 1720s, summarized the situation as he saw it in the following terms, and I quote, "I am greatly persuaded that the generality of preachers talk of an unknown, unfelt Christ. And the reason why congregations have been so dead is because dead men preach to them." So it seemed to many that Puritanism was in the process of becoming what we might now call the civil religion of New England, whose primary functions were social and moral rather than theological or spiritual. Yet there were signs of change beginning to emerge as early as 1727. Theodore Frelinghuysen, a Dutch pastor who was ministering to a congregation in the Raritan Valley of New Jersey, began to notice evidence of revival, and signs of new growth began to appear in a broad sweep of territory from New Jersey to Pennsylvania and Virginia. But we're focusing on the year 1734, in which an extraordinary series of events took place in the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, in response to the preaching of the man now widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential American theologians, of course, Jonathan Edwards. So let me remind you of the main landmarks in Edwards' life. Edwards was born in East Windsor, Connecticut on the 5th of October, 1703, and his father was a local pastor under whose ministry a series of revivals would take place in the 1720s. In September 1716, Edwards entered Yale College, New Haven, now of course Yale University, where he later served as a tutor from 1724 to 26. And when he was around 17 years of age, Edwards underwent a conversion experience. As he read 1 Timothy 1:17, he was overwhelmed by a sense of God's greatness and glory. As I read those words, he wrote later in his personal journal, there came into my soul, and it was, as it were, diffused through it, a sense of the glory of the divine being, a new sense quite different from anything I ever experienced before. In 1726, Edwards resigned his post at Yale to become a pastor at Northampton, serving as a colleague of his maternal grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. And Stoddard was widely regarded as a leading spiritual authority in the Connecticut Valley, in fact, so much that people tended to call him Pope Stoddard behind his back. Edwards was ordained on 15th of February, 1727, aged 23. And in July of that year, he married Sarah Pierpont, whom he'd been in love with for some considerable time. Stoddard died in 1729, leaving Edwards in charge of one of the most important churches in the area. And reflecting on his ministry during those 2 years, Edwards noted a general lack of interest in religion in Northampton, which virtually all of colonial North America, like it just seemed to be, as Edwards put it, at that time very insensible of the things of religion and engaged in other cares and pursuits. Now that situation changed radically, suddenly, at Northampton in the winter of 1734 to 35. And during the final weeks of 1735, several sudden conversions took place. And this revival continued into the new year, reaching its peak during the months of March and April 1735. Most households in the town were affected, with perhaps as many as 300 individuals experiencing conversion. And Christianity, once something which seemed strange, distant, and external, became something inward, vital, and real. And Edwards published accounts of these remarkable events at Northampton in the form of a book, which drew international attention to this awakening. And between 1737 and 39, this book went through 3 editions and 20 printings. Now, in a letter of December the 12th, 1743, Edwards wrote to Thomas Prince in Boston, relating his memories of these events, of that remarkable period, including a series of 4 sermons preached by George Whitefield, who had recently arrived from England. Let me just read you a few lines from this letter. Whitefield preached here 4 sermons in the meeting house, besides a private lecture at my house, one on Friday, another on Saturday, and 2 upon the Sabbath. The congregation was extraordinarily melted by every sermon, almost the whole assembly being in tears for a great part of sermon time. As this evangelical revival gathered momentum in North America and England, the happenings at Northampton were seen as the harbingers of that dawn. And as the revival continued in New England, it was given a new sense of direction by Whitefield and others. And of course, Edwards found he was no longer at the forefront of this revival movement. And he was also troubled by divisions within his congregation at Northampton over matters of church discipline. So he moved to minister at a congregation at Stockbridge, where relatively light parish duties allowed him to write a series of major theological works which gave intellectual muscle to New England Puritanism. In 1757, his reputation as a scholar firmly established, Edwards was invited to become the 3rd president of the College of New Jersey, Princeton. Now, of course, Princeton University. Following an unsuccessful inoculation against smallpox, he died at Princeton on March 22nd, 1758. And I'm sure that some of you here today have visited his grave in the local cemetery. That, then, is a brief account of Edwards' life. Much more needs to be said, but I think I've given you a good idea of his historical context. So, why is Edwards so significant? What can we learn from him? As the large number of academic monographs and articles published in Edwards makes clear, he is seen as being of significant theological importance, especially within the Reformed theological tradition, even though his influence extends far beyond that tradition. Yet Edwards has received a wider readership. Influential North American popular writers such as J.I. Packer and John Piper have developed sophisticated approaches to preaching, spirituality, and personal spiritual growth, which are clearly based on Edwards' approaches. So in this lecture, I want to honor both these constituencies, the academy, the church, and consider Edwards' importance for both academy and church. Intellectual historians recognize the complexity of Edwards' ideas and often present him as offering a synthesis of traditional Puritan piety and an Enlightenment belief in the potential of the human will and an almost mystical appreciation of natural beauty. Edwards' unusual combination of scientific rationalism and a living faith has generated a scholarly debate about whether Edwards should be understood as the last great Puritan or the first American Romantic. It's as if Edwards holds together aspects of 17th century Puritan culture and 18th century Enlightenment ideals. Now, I personally don't think Edwards is being inconsistent in doing so. I think he has a richer vision of both Christian theology and cultural engagement than many at his time, and that we can learn from engaging him. Edwards placed an emphasis on the importance of religious affections, yet he also stressed the rationality of faith and did much to encourage theological engagement with the forms of philosophy that were influential in America at this time. Some scholars see this as a historical accident. Edwards just happened to minister at a time when a pietist emphasis on a religion of the heart was being displaced by a rationalist emphasis on a reasonable faith. He combined both simply on account of his historical location. But I don't think this is persuasive. Edwards saw these aspects of the Christian faith, intellectual, emotional, as interconnected and mutually enriching, in much the same way as C.S. Lewis held together reason and imagination in a rich and deeply satisfying synthesis. So let me begin with a thoroughly theological topic, the doctrine of the Trinity. This doctrine plays a central role in Edwards' theology, preaching, and spirituality. Now, in the 20th century, of course, we've seen a revival of interest in this doctrine, partly as a result of the theological program of Karl Barth, which continues into the 21st century. And maybe it's too easy for us to forget that the doctrine of the Trinity was generally seen as a theological and pastoral irrelevance by many in the 18th and 19th century. For example, many leading English theologians of the 17th century seem to have held on to the doctrine of the Trinity out of respect for tradition, while privately conceding that it seemed irrational in the light of the growing emphasis upon the reasonableness of Christianity, and also that it seemed to provide little in the way of spiritual or theological benefits. And while simplifications are dangerous, defense of this doctrine seems to have been seen as little more than a formal expectation on the part of Orthodox theologians. So why is that observation important? Because the doctrine of the Trinity provides an intellectual framework that safeguards an active conception of God. It provides a defense against a reduced, generic notion of divinity which limits God's action to the creation and the ordering of the world. And the 20th century theologian Emil Brunner spoke of the Trinity as a security doctrine, a Schutzlehre, protecting Christian theology against deficient notions of God. And Protestant theologians of the late 17th and early 18th century tended to adopt an essentially deist notion of God in their public defense of Christianity. Having set to one side an incarnational notion of God entering into the world and any notion of the Holy Spirit as God's activity within the world, they were left with the notion of a God who designed and created the world and after that ceased to be involved with it. And these views became widespread at Harvard College, later of course Harvard University, which trained Reformed clergy for ministry in the New England area. My point is, a disinterest in the doctrine of the Trinity seems to be linked with an exclusive focus on God as creator. And we can see this perhaps most clearly in the writings of the English theologian William Paley. And in his well-known book, Natural Theology of 1802, Paley speaks of God as someone who designs and creates, but has no further involvement with the natural order. And Paley was fascinated with the intricate structures of the human body and other biological organisms, but he interpreted this in terms of God's past activity, which was taken to imply God's continuing existence. And Paley's lack of interest in the concept of the Trinity, which was representative of his age, reflects his notion of God, which minimized any ongoing divine presence and activity within the world. But Edwards, in marked contrast, knew of God's work of conversion and revival in the Great Awakening, and realized the need for an alignment of our intellectual reflection about God with the evidence of divine activity and presence in those great events of 1734, as well, of course, as to the biblical witness to the nature and action of God. Now, while the Trinity was not the primary focus of Edwards' major polemical treatises, Trinitarianism is evident throughout his theological and philosophical works. In common with many Reformed theologians of his age, Edwards recognized the Bible did not explicitly develop a concept of the Trinity, nor did it develop an extensive Trinitarian vocabulary. But Edwards argued it was necessary to go beyond the Bible's vocabulary in order to do justice to the rich vision of God that the Bible unfolds. Today, of course, the doctrine of the Trinity has again become central to Christian theological discourse. The work of theologians like Karl Barth or Karl Rahner has led to a major exercise of theological retrieval, in which the doctrine of the Trinity has been reaffirmed along with its implications for divine action and presence within the world. Christianity has always known and affirmed God as one who acts within the world. And of course, the emergence of the Pentecostal movement in the 20th century represents a further correction of inadequate ways of conceiving God's action. So how does Edwards help us here? Well, writers like Robert Jenson and others have shown that Edwards offers us an important resource as we continue to reflect on the biblical foundations of the doctrine of the Trinity, its importance in theological reflection today, and above all, the importance of this doctrine for preaching and spirituality. Now, later in this lecture, I'm going to reflect on John Piper's high regard for Edwards, focusing on the theme of desiring God. But let me quote to you from Piper's little book, Think, published in 2011, in which he speaks about the way in which Edwards' theology of the Trinity spoke to him. One of the gifts Edwards gave me, which I had not found anywhere else, was a foundation for human thinking and feeling in the Trinitarian nature of God. I don't mean that others haven't seen human nature rooted in God's nature. I simply mean that the way Edwards saw it was extraordinary. He showed me that human thinking and feeling do not exist arbitrarily. They exist because we are in the image of God, and God's thinking and feeling are more deeply part of his Trinitarian being than I had realized. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of holding on to this Trinitarian vision of God and affirming Jonathan Edwards as a pastorally engaged thinker who has much to say on this theme. In the United States, there are good reasons for suggesting that a generalized and generic deism, similar to that of the 18th century Age of Reason, is gaining a new acceptability for political reasons. The American sociologist Robert Beller's observations about the emergence of what he calls American civil religion during the 1960s should be noted here. The phenomenon of civil religion requires maximum commonality, which in turn leads to an emphasis on the lowest common denominator of religions and a corresponding de-emphasis of the distinctive features of, for example, a Trinitarian concept of God. And this civil religion allows Christianity, Judaism, and Islam to be positioned within a common theological matrix that maximizes social inclusivity. Now, this is not really a cultural innovation, in that one of the original motivations for the minimalist deism of 17th and 18th century Europe was its potential for maximizing social and religious cohesion within religiously divided contexts. And this civil religion prefers to think of God as a moral legislator rather than someone who actively intervenes in the natural or social processes. Now, I appreciate that the situation in Korea is not the same as in the United States at this point, but this is important. However, there is another development within American popular culture which I think is important to you here in Korea. The growing trend towards what some have called a moralistic therapeutic deism on the part of some younger Christians. Now, this phrase, moralistic therapeutic deism, was introduced by the American sociologist Christian Smith and Belina Lundquist-Denton in 2005 to refer to an understanding of religion as a positive moral and therapeutic factor in life, which tends to marginalize the creedal and the theological dimensions of faith and speaks of God primarily in terms of enhancing the quality of life. Edwards, as we're going to see, was a passionate advocate of God's role in transforming and fulfilling human existence, but he saw this as being linked with a robust and distinctive vision of the nature of God, which was safeguarded and expressed in the doctrine of the Trinity. Of Edwards' many contributions to Christian theology, I want to single out for discussion here his response to the challenge posed to the proclamation of the gospel by the rise of modern culture. 18th century New England saw the birth of attitudes which are now commonplace among many in North America and beyond, including Korea. One of those is the phenomenon of the self-made man, In his book, The Americanization of Benjamin Franklin, published in 2004, the historian Gordon Wood identifies Benjamin Franklin, who lived a generation after Edwards, as second only to George Washington in terms of his influence on shaping the cultural norms of this new nation. So what was Franklin's big idea? For Wood, it was simply this: the idea that a man could make his own fortune in the world, regardless of his social origins or status, if he worked hard enough. Now, Franklin's own description of his rise to fame and prominence left ample room for the contribution of other people and God, but later editions of Franklin's autobiography altered his statements to make Franklin an image of the self-made man. So here is the edited sentence, which captured the imagination of countless people in America and remains iconic for many throughout the world. It presents Franklin as someone who set out unaided to transcend himself. From the poverty and obscurity in which I was born, I have raised myself to a state of affluence and some degree of celebrity in the world. Now, Jonathan Edwards could see this outlook developing even in his own day. It's an outlook that leaves no room for the grace of God. It does not acknowledge our sinfulness. It is a Pelagian ethic of self-achievement. And I think you know this attitude today in Korea. So what does Edwards do to counter such an attitude? I'm going to pick up on some points that Edward made in his sermons preached around the time of the Great Awakening, in which he offers theologically informed criticism of cultural attitudes such as the phenomenon of civil religion and the concept of the self-made man. So let's begin with the issue of civil religion, which began to emerge, although not by that name, in America around this time. This arose in part from the Halfway Covenant, which encouraged congregations to admit nominal Christians. And in his church at Northampton, Edwards encountered a large number of individuals who had been baptized for the sake of social convention, and who saw attending church simply as a civil duty. The idea that they were somehow sinners seemed offensive to such upright citizens. They were halfway to faith, but how could they be taken the remainder of the way? How could they be convinced of sin and of the need for repentance and conversion? So in a series of sermons, Edwards mounted a vigorous attack on the religious pragmatism of his day. God is not impressed by human achievements. He does not take them into account in his verdict of justification. The judgment of the world, the judgment of American society, whether it happens to be that of 18th century Northampton or modern day New York, must give way to the judgment of God. For in the end, it is what God makes of us that matters, not what prevailing social or moral conventions affirms. God judges the believer to be righteous, not on account of the believer's achievements, but on account of what Christ achieved on the cross. So Edwards thus insists upon the reality of human sin, a theme which he would return to again and again and develop at length in his major writing, Original Sin. To these halfway Christians, the very idea of sin was offensive. And many members of Edwards' Northampton congregation seem to have confused conformity to social expectations with righteousness. For such people, being described as a sinner meant being a bad neighbor, or being caught in an adulterous relationship, or adopting unacceptable business practices. Sin had degenerated into a social flaw. Its reference to a relationship with God was lost. And Edwards protests powerfully against this trend. All human beings, he argues, have fallen short of the glory of God. They may conform to social conventions, at least some of the time, but that's not the same thing as being righteous before God. It's perfectly possible to be an upright and respected citizen, or at least to be thought of in this way, while at the same time being deeply alienated from God. All of us, he insists, share what he calls an innate sinful depravity of the heart. And without this awareness of the reality and power of sin, redemption loses its relevance. The weaker your idea of sin, the more impoverished is your understanding of salvation. If sin is understood socially, redemption comes to mean little more than being enabled to take a proper place in society. And God is simply left out of the matter altogether. Society and its values come to take the place of God. Edwards' Northampton congregation had a seriously deficient understanding of sin with a correspondingly inadequate understanding of redemption. Let me turn now to a theme which is important in relation to Edwards, and this is the concept of theological retrieval. This phrase is now widely used to refer to the project of drawing on the church's history of theology and practice for contemporary constructive purposes. It's about reaching into our past and finding ideas and practices that can inform and enrich theology and ministry today. And many today have found that the Puritan legacy has the capacity to bring a new quality and depth to their theology and their pastoral ministry. So I'm going to speak for a while about this interest in retrieving the Puritan legacy in general. I'm going to look at how the theologian J.I. Packer developed an interest in this field, with particular reference to his well-known books, Knowing God and A Quest for Godliness. And then ask how Packer and also John Piper use Edwards in developing their approaches to preaching and spirituality. So let me begin with Jim Packer, who was converted while he was a student at Oxford University in October 1944. Now, Packer was an intelligent and reflective person, but he soon began to encounter difficulties in growing in his faith. He was unable to deal with the ongoing presence of sin in his life. So, what should he do? Packer realized he needed a theological framework within which he could position and understand his spiritual struggles and thus find a solution to them. Packer's answer came unexpectedly a year after his conversion, when he was asked to curate a collection of old books that had been given to the Oxford Intercollegiate Christian Union by C.O.N. Pickard Cambridge, a former missionary in Japan. And this included the works of the leading Puritan thinker, John Owen. Two of Owen's treatises seemed to Packer to address and illuminate his own spiritual anxieties on indwelling sin and on the mortification of sin. And as Packer read those works, he realized they seemed to speak to his condition. Here, he believed, was a theologically serious and pastorally rooted approach to the problems of the Christian life, which could be part of his emerging evangelical vision of faith. It was a kind of theological epiphany which opened his eyes and his mind to a viable and defensible way of understanding and living out the life of faith. And it's remained at the heart of Packer's spirituality and theology ever since. As some of you will know, Packer's Oxford doctorate explored the theology of salvation of the Puritan writer Richard Baxter, which Packer found particularly interesting. Now, Packer's 1945 discovery of the personal spiritual value of the writings of John Owen clearly came as a surprise to him. Confronted with an inadequate 20th century response to an age-old problem, his initial instinct might have been to look around for a more recent response that seemed palatable or workable. Yet, Packer's accidental encounter with the Christian past helped him to realize that most questions arising from the Christian faith have been engaged in the past. So, might some of those classic responses remain helpful today, capable of guiding and informing our own thinking? And Packer maintained and developed a strategy of critical reappropriation and retrieval throughout his career, seeing himself as someone who has garnered riches from the pasture lands of the past in order to make them intelligible and accessible to a new readership today. Now, here's how he described his own approach to theology in 1996. I theologize out of what I see as the authentic biblical and creedal mainstream of Christian identity, the confessional and liturgical great tradition that the church has characteristically maintained from the start. And so for Packer, keeping company with yesterday's great teachers, such as the Puritans, helps us to open our eyes to wisdom that might otherwise be denied us. Now, Packer's understanding of the contemporary relevance and value of Puritanism for Christian living was set out in his book, A Quest for Godliness, The Puritan Vision of the Christian Life, published in 1990. And this important and influential work is based on lectures Packer delivered to the Puritan and Reformed Studies Conference in London, mainly during the 1950s and early 1960s. And in these, he set out to describe the Puritan vision of the Christian life and to embed this in the church of today. And Packer identified the essence of Puritanism as lying primarily in its vision of the transformation of humanity leading to spiritual maturity, an amalgam of wisdom, goodwill, resilience, and creativity. And for Packer, Puritanism was at heart a spiritual movement passionately concerned with God and godliness. And although this vision was rigorously grounded in theology, it was essentially an experiential, or to use the language of the past age, an experimental religion. Packer wrote, Puritanism was essentially an experimental faith, a religion of heart work, a sustained practice of seeking the face of God in a way that our own Christianity too often is not. Packer's own spirituality, expressed in writings such as Knowing God, 1973, echoes some of the themes that he finds in the Puritans. As he later reflected, the Puritans made him aware that all theology is also spirituality, in the sense that it has an influence, good or bad, positive or negative, on its recipient's relationship or lack of relationship with God. And although Puritan spirituality is sometimes portrayed by its critics as otherworldly, being inattentive to the problems and concerns of everyday life, Packer points out that this judgment is hasty and unperceptive. He wrote, the Puritans' awareness that in the midst of life we are in death, just one step from eternity, gave them a deep seriousness, calm yet passionate, with regard to the business of living. While insisting we should have heaven in our eye through our earthly pilgrimage, they also insisted this hope of glory must inform and sustain our earthly life, affecting our relationship with others and our attitudes to the world around us. And Puritans viewed this life as the gymnasium and dressing room where we're prepared for heaven, teaching us that preparation for death is the first step in learning to truly live. Now, Packer was especially appreciative of the strong links between theology and spirituality that he found in Puritan writers, including Jonathan Edwards. And Packer welcomed Edwards' emphasis on the religious affections as a necessary and important corrective to any form of dry, cerebral orthodoxy. And in my view, Packer's finest and most focused statement on his views of the relation of spirituality and theology is found in his inaugural lecture as the first Sang-Woo Yutong-Chi Professor of Theology at Regent College in Vancouver. And this lecture, delivered in the college chapel in December 1989, was entitled An Introduction to Systematic Spirituality. Yet Packer had earlier pointed out that many of those who admire Edwards tended to overlook his most original contribution to theology. And for Packer, that was his pioneer elucidation of biblical teaching on the subject of revival. And happily, this has now changed, because Edwards' theology of revival is now considered by many to be a significant resource for placing contemporary phenomena of revival within a theological context. So that's Packer. Let me turn now to another recent writer who has also found Edwards theologically and spiritually transformative, and of course I'm speaking about John Piper, author of the outstanding work Desiring God, which sets out some of the leading themes of Edwards' spirituality. Piper grasped some key core themes of Edwards' theology. Above all, his holding together of the religious affections and reasoned argument, and then proceeded to expound its wider spiritual importance on the basis of a rigorous academic engagement, bringing out the remarkable ability of this Puritan heritage to illuminate and inform contemporary concerns and issues. For both Packer and Piper, wise retrieval of the past leads to individual and communal renewal in the present. So let's think about Piper's book, Desiring God, and ask what we can learn from this. Piper served as a senior pastor of Bethlehem Baptist Church, Minneapolis in Minnesota for 33 years, from 1980 to 2013. And Piper originally studied at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, where he was introduced to the writings of Edwards by Daniel P. Fuller, the school's professor of hermeneutics. And after reading Edwards, Piper realized his potential for preaching and ministry. As Piper later wrote, "No one outside Scripture has shaped my vision of God and the Christian faith more than Jonathan Edwards." Today, Piper is often referred to as the best-known popularizer of Edwards in America today, a description which I think is entirely justified. And in his later writings, Piper made a connection that I think is really interesting and defensible and actually quite productive, and that is seeing a link between C.S. Lewis and Edwards, especially in relation to the joy of faith. Now, Piper discovered Edwards' works while he was a student at Wheaton College, Illinois, and he was especially drawn to Lewis's sermon called The Weight of Glory of 1941. So, what did Piper find in Edwards? Let me explore with you what he found. And why I'm exploring this question? Well, there are two reasons. First, our own appreciation, understanding of any thinker, whether C.S. Lewis, John Calvin, or Jonathan Edwards, can be stimulated and developed by considering what other people have found in his writings. But secondly, Piper models a strategy of retrieval that I think we can use in engaging with Edwards, but extend to other writers as well. So let's look at Piper's reflections on Edwards. Piper, as many of you will know, studied for his doctorate in New Testament studies at the University of Munich in Germany, and went on to become associate professor of New Testament studies at Bethel College, Minnesota. Yet while he was in Munich, Piper was busy devouring Edwards' book, Religious Affections. And as he read this book, slowly savoring its insights, he found that he was being challenged and changed by its vision of the Christian life. I want you to listen to these words from Piper's 1998 book, God's Passion for His Glory. This book, Religious Affections, convinced me of sinful lukewarmness in my affections towards God, and inspired in me a passion to know and love God as I ought. Now, Edwards, Piper realized, brought together two worlds which were so often separated, yet rightly belonged together: revival fervor and reasonable apprehension of truth. Now, in my view, Piper is right in this judgment. Yet he saw in Edwards someone who could be used with great pastoral and spiritual effect, an application that lay beyond the world of scholarship and extended to the ministry of the church. In 1978, Piper published an academic article in the Scottish Journal of Theology entitled Jonathan Edwards on the Problem of Faith and History. I personally don't see this article as illuminating Piper's spiritual applications of Edwards, but it does make it clear that Piper knew and respected Edwards. Piper chose to leave Bethel College after 6 years in its faculty and become a pastor in downtown Minneapolis. So what led him to make that decisive change? Piper had come to believe that the methods and values of the academic world did not allow the gospel in all its richness to be fully grasped and proclaimed. So listen to these words from Piper's own account of his decision to leave the academic world. The Lord seemed to be saying, I will not simply be analyzed, I will be adored. I will not simply be pondered, I will be proclaimed. Now, Piper set out what he discovered in the writings of Edwards in his hugely influential book, Desiring God. And although Piper acknowledges the importance of C.S. Lewis and Pascal, it's clear that the dominant presence and influence is Jonathan Edwards. So listen to these words taken from the opening section of the book. I must pursue joy in God if I am to glorify him as a surpassingly valuable reality in the universe. Joy is not a mere option alongside worship. It is an essential component of worship. And although Piper presents his Christian hedonism as predominantly a meditation on Scripture, it's fair to suggest that it's a meditation on Scripture which is particularly informed by Edwards. Now, let me make clear, this is not a lecture about John Piper, but you can understand why I've chosen to focus on Piper for the last few moments. He's an excellent example of someone who has seen something in Edwards that he believes to be important, biblical, and applicable to the Christian life. And I'm confident that there will be many in this audience today who also believe they have found something in Edwards' writings that is theologically generative or pastorally relevant. And my advice is to follow through on this. You can enrich all of our discussions and reflections in doing so, and at the same time serve the Christian church. Now, I've not yet mentioned what I myself find so interesting in Edwards, namely his emphasis on the beauty of nature. And in bringing this lecture to a close, I want to highlight what I find to be so interesting about Edwards in this respect. The British scholar Patrick Sherry has argued, I think with excellent reasons, that Edwards made beauty more central to his theology than anyone else in the history of Christian thought, including Augustine of Hippo and Hans von Balthasar. So, why was beauty so important to him? Well, the short answer, which I'm going to try and expand in this section, is that Edwards appeals to God's works, including the work of creation, as a way of grasping the beauty of God more firmly. So let me begin by quoting from Edwards' Miscellanies, a collection of early notes that were never intended for publication, but have proved fascinating to Edwards scholars. As I read this, I want you to note the emphasis on how God's works are able to disclose something of God. It is very fit and becoming of God, who is infinitely wise, so to order things that there should be a voice of his in his works, instructing those that behold him, and painting forth and showing divine mysteries and things more immediately appertaining to himself and his spiritual kingdom. The works of God are but a kind of voice or language of God to instruct intelligent beings in things pertaining to himself. So let me locate Edwards within the Reformed tradition so we can understand the basic framework within which he is working. A leading theme in the early sections of Calvin's 1559 edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion is that God created the world and that signs of its divine origin can be found in both the beauty and complexity of the world, as well as in our own personal consciousness of a presence of God. I want to focus here on Calvin's comments on the witness of the natural world around us to what Calvin terms the wonders of God's wisdoms. Why? Well, because Calvin wants to make it clear that an appreciation of the beauty and wisdom of the creation leads to an enhanced and deepened appreciation of God as their creator. So here's what Calvin has to say. There are innumerable witnesses in heaven and on earth that declare the wonders of his wisdom. Not only those arcane matters for the closer observation of which astronomy, medicine, and all of natural science are intended, but also those which force themselves upon the sight of even the most unlearned and ignorant people, so that they cannot open their eyes without being forced to see them. And the Reformed tradition within which Edwards stands followed Calvin in thinking of the natural world as the theater of God's glory. Nature reveals God as creator, which is an important first step leading to a saving knowledge of God as redeemer. And we find this idea developed further in Reformed confessions like the Belgic Confession, which affirms that the universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book designed to encourage us to ponder the invisible things of God, while also emphasizing that the Bible both clarifies and extends this knowledge of God, setting it on a more reliable foundation. And that image of the natural world as a beautiful book proved highly significant, especially in encouraging the development of natural sciences within Protestantism. And of course, we find it inside Edwards himself. Again, listen to this quote from the Miscellanies. The book of Scripture is the interpreter of the book of nature in two ways. That is, by declaring to us those spiritual mysteries that are indeed signified and typified in the constitution of the natural world, and secondly, in actually making application of the signs and types in the book of nature as representations of those spiritual mysteries in many instances. Now, this metaphor of the two books, the book of Scripture, the book of nature, it was widely used within Protestantism in the late 16th and throughout the 17th centuries to affirm and preserve the distinctiveness of the natural science and Christian theology on the one hand, yet to affirm their capacity for interaction on the other. And Calvin encouraged a dialogue between the natural sciences and theology, recognizing both the parallels and divergences between these two books. And Calvin wrote, the knowledge of God, which is clearly shown in the ordering of the world and in all creatures, is still more clearly and familiarly explained in his word. So this metaphor of God's two books rests on the fundamental belief that a God who created the world is also the God who is disclosed in and through the Christian Bible. And without that underlying informing assumption, the two books need be seen as nothing more than two disconnected entities. But the link between them is established and safeguarded by the Christian theological assumption of a creator God who is revealed in the Bible. Now, a similar point is made by the modern American theologian Robert Jenson in his, I think, very good book, America's Theologian, a recommendation of Jonathan Edwards. And Jenson notes with approval the way in which Edwards connects God's holiness and God's beauty with significant implications for Edwards' encounter with and reading of the book of nature. For Edwards, Christians are able to perceive the glory or the beauty of divine things, which the Bible calls the beauty of holiness. For example, Psalm 29, verse 2. And Edwards' vision of Christian theology affirms the beauty of God on the one hand and God's desire to be known on the other. God is distinguished from all other things by his beauty. Yet God is not content of self-absorption or self-contemplation, emphasizing the role of Christ as the agent of creation. Edwards argues that the world of nature mirrors the divine beauty. Again, let me read you a section from the Miscellanies in which this point is so clearly made. When we are delighted with flowery meadows and gentle breezes of wind, we may consider that we only see the emanations of the sweet benevolence of Jesus Christ. When we behold the fragrant rose and lily, we see his love and purity. So the green trees and fields singing of birds are emanations of his infinite joy and benignity. The easiness and naturalness of trees and vines are shadows of his infinite beauty and loveliness. The crystal rivers and murmuring streams have the footsteps of his sweet grace and bounty. For Edwards, God desires his beauty to be known and enjoyed by his creatures, and thus chooses to communicate that beauty through the creation so that all might see, acknowledge, and respond to it. Again, listen to Edwards reflecting on nature as a type of God. The word type here meaning a form of representation of God that can only be fully understood and appreciated from within the standpoint of the Christian faith. He writes, I believe the whole universe, heaven and earth, air and seas, and the divine constitution and history of the Holy Scriptures be full of divine things as language is of words. Nature is meant to disclose the beauty of God, functioning as a school of desire in which humanity may learn to perceive God's glory and respond in faith and awe. So what are the apologetic implications of Edwards' emphasis on the beauty of God? Well, for Edwards, rational argument has a valuable and important place in Christian apologetics. But it's not the only, and perhaps not even the most important, resource for the apologist. For Edwards, what really matters is an apprehension of divine glory, which arises through a perception of the beauty of God, whether it's disclosed through Scripture or the beauty of the natural world. Again, listen to this important statement in Edwards' treatise on the religious affections. Though great use may be made of external arguments, there is no spiritual conviction or judgment, but what arises from an apprehension of the spiritual beauty and glory of divine things. Now, Edwards' argument is significant and it needs close attention. The heart of his analysis is that rational arguments don't convert. They may remove obstacles to conversion, but in themselves and of themselves, they don't possess the capacity to transform humanity. So instead, we need to aim to convey or bring about what Edwards calls an apprehension of the spiritual beauty and glory of divine things. Divine revelation is about capturing the human imagination with glimpses of divine glory, not simply persuading the mind with impressions of rationality. And Edwards' appeal to the beauty of nature as an apologetic strategy actually has a lot to commend it, especially as a culture dominated by forms of rationalism associated with the Enlightenment begins to fade and lose its appeal. I need to say more about this point, as it's important in itself as well as to understanding the contemporary significance of Edwards. I need to emphasize that while Edwards never wrote a formal work on apologetics, his miscellanies are packed full of apologetic reflection and explorations. And Edwards develops two streams of apologetic engagement. First, a rational approach, which resonates well with the views that were becoming commonplace in the American states in the 1720s. And Edwards often engages with philosophical concerns arising, for example, from the works of the leading English philosopher John Locke, and he also affirms the importance of rational argument in challenging the views of atheism and reinforcing the faith of believers. And I'm very clear myself that Edward remains an important resource for us in this approach to apologetics. But there is also a second strand to his approach, which I think needs to be appropriated and developed further in our changing cultural situation. Just as C.S. Lewis held together reason and the imagination, so Edwards holds together the reason and the heart. His appeal to what we might call a sense of the human heart has real importance for us today. So let me make clear, I'm not denying or devaluing Edwards' excellent rational apologetics. I'm simply pointing out that there is another strand to his approach which I believe has a special significance and utility in today's cultural situation. It's clear Edwards believed apologetics needed to help people to grasp the glory of Christ, and that this glory itself had the capacity to transform and convert sinners. And of course, for Edwards, this glory is revealed most clearly in the gospel and carries its own evidence of truth. Edwards put it like this in The Religious Affections. The mind ascends to the truth of the gospel but by one step, and that is its divine glory. Edwards thus commends the preaching of the gospel, as I do as well. But Edwards has a second line of approach. Since nature is God's creation, something of God's glory can be discerned within the world of nature. Again, a quote from the Miscellanies. The immense magnificence of the visible world in inconceivable vastness, the incomprehensible height of the heavens and so on, is but a type of the infinite magnificent height and glory of God's world in the spiritual world, the most incomprehensible expression of his power, wisdom, holiness, and love in what is wrought and brought to pass in the world, and the exceeding nature of the moral and natural good, the light, knowledge, holiness, and happiness which shall be communicated to it, and therefore to that magnificence of the world. So for Edwards, the beauty of nature is a gateway to discovering the greater beauty of God. And again, Edwards develops this point elsewhere in his writings. He says this in his Nature of True Virtue. God is the foundation and fountain of all being and all beauty, from whom all is perfectly derived, and on whom all is most absolutely and perfectly dependent, of whom and through whom and to whom all being and all perfection, and whose being and beauty is, as it were, the sum and comprehension of all existence and excellence, much more than the sun is the fountain and summary comprehension of all the light and brightness to this day. Now, some will want to raise a question here. Surely we ought to be drawn to the rational persuasiveness of the gospel rather than the beauty of God. And I understand this concern, but we are called to love God and love what we find beautiful. To discover the beauty of God is to find something about God that makes us long to be with him, to relate to him, and draw close to him. Beauty is, if I could put it like this, self-authenticating. I don't need to prove that something or someone is beautiful. Rather, I find them to be beautiful and am drawn to them for that reason. God draws himself to us by his beauty, reflected reliably but not completely by the beauty of creation, or indeed worship. We see something similar happening in the way beautiful music and works of art can draw us closer and closer. Once we hear and see their beauty, we want more and more, and we're drawn to them, not by reason, but by something deeper and more profound, which Edwards recognized. And that, I think, affects the way we do apologetics. We can argue the truth of the gospel, but we can show the beauty of God. I hope you can see the difference. Nature is like a mirror reflecting God's beauty in a way adapted to our limits and capacities. We can point to the beauty of nature, and this invites people to discover the even greater beauty of God as its creator. And Edwards argues this eventually leads to conversion and the renewal of our natures. So I must bring this to an end. Let me read you Edwards' description of the converted believer and invite you to reflect on the remarkable and striking imagery that Edwards used to depict the believer's life of trusting God, receiving God's benefit and grace as a flower in the field receives the warmth and the light of the sun. And in writing this passage, Edwards recalled his younger days in which he spent time in fields and meadows, savoring the beauty of their flowers and realizing their total dependence on the light and warmth of the sun, which for Edwards echoed the total dependence of the Christian on the grace of God. Listen to this. The soul of the true Christian, as I then wrote my meditations, appeared like such a little white flower, as we see in the spring of the year, low and humble on the ground, opening its bosom to receive the pleasant beams of the sun's glory, rejoicing as it were in a calm rapture, diffusing around a sweet fragrancy, standing peacefully and lovingly in the midst of other flowers round about, all in like manner opening their bosoms to drink in the light of the sun. And I think that's a wonderful image with which to close this lecture. We are flowers in the garden of God, drinking in the light of God's radiance. So, I must end this lecture, not because I've even begun to do justice to the richness and range of Edwards' Christian theology, but because I've run out of time. I hope, however, that this brief engagement with Edwards will encourage you to explore him still further. He has so much to offer, both the theologian and the preacher. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.